I'm Daniele Vidoni from the European Commission, and I'm moderating this first panel on the effectiveness of actually the empirical evidence as an educational policy tool. The members of the panel are Dr. Ricci, President of INVALSI. I don't think we need any additional presentation for him. Are Sabine Mate, who's the co-head of Research and Analysis Unit and the head of the Sampling Unit of IEA, the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement. Then we have next Leslie Lukowski, who is Professor of Qualitative and Quantitative Research Methodology at Vienna University, as well as the Chair of the PISA Technical Advisory Group and of the NIPE Questionnaire Standing Committee. Then next to that we have Hernan Habs, who is Professor of Education Research at the University of Duisburg-Essen and the Principal Advisor for the IEA ICCS 2022, as well as previous founding director of the Interdisciplinary Center for Integration of Migration and Research. And then Ernesto Treviño, who is Professor of Education at the Catholic University of Chile and Senior Researcher at the UNESCO Latin American Laboratory for the Evaluation of Quality of Education. As you can see, we have a range of panelists who basically represent and bring us witness from everywhere and from all the angles of the world. And this is a bit the idea of this panel. Try to get a bit of an overview of how evidence and education are, let's say, discussed in the different areas of the world. I will start with a question that will be the same for all the panelists, and I ask each panelist to take 3, maximum 4 minutes for question, for answering the question. Then I'll ask 3-4 questions in general, and I ask each panelist to take a couple of questions. We'll try to keep it condensed so that we will have also some time for questions from the room. So let's get it started right away. And my first question is, in your opinion, what are the advantages and disadvantages of using international and national large-scale assessment to inform education policy at national and international level? And if you can provide some examples from your national or international perspective. And I guess we start with the back.
Thank you, Daniele. I think this is a very important question and is extremely important today because we are facing the challenges that we have by using the money of the European Union in order to recover all the problems that we experienced during the pandemic. But I should say that it is important to use the data of international and national assessment. I'm thinking about the school system in order to take into consideration an evidence-based perspective. Nowadays, at least in our country, it's not always the case. So quite often we take decisions, we invest billions without any evaluation of the impact of the efficacy of our policies. But at the same time, this approach, it means to go outside the schools, to compare results, could be at the same time also a disadvantage. Because sometimes we use the data, we ask the data to take the decision that we are not able to take because we have no vision in the future where we like to go with our school system. Just to give you an example, we have a lot of money to invest in terms of to prevent or to reduce the dropout, but in my perspective, it's a good idea to use the data in order to improve this kind of policies, but at the same time, we have a lack of vision where we like to bring our system in the future. And I think the use of data could be at the same time are good aspects and maybe are not that good aspects. So I think we should help the system in, how can I say, look into the data, a kind of confirmation, a kind of evidence-based indications about our vision of the school system of education, what we have in mind about our good citizens for the near future. So the data are very useful, but they cannot be used instead of our vision, of our general idea of education.
Yeah, there was one. So I'm working for the IEA, so I guess it's not a surprise for you that in my view, this data is of extraordinary value. So we are doing all these large-scale assessments and we really believe that they are very helpful. So they give really valuable insights into the state of our education systems. Many of the studies are trend studies, so we can also monitor what is happening, what is the development of all these education systems. And they are of really high quality, yeah? So we can really rely on what is the data telling us. So I think that this is a very important point to begin with. However, because you're also asking about disadvantages, so is there really a disadvantage about doing large-scale assessment? I don't think there's really a disadvantage. But what I can see is there is a dilemma if you think about education and policy overall because of timing. So I think policymakers have always a very short sight in terms of changing things. And this is completely different to education. In education, everything takes time. If you do a reform, then if you are lucky, you can see 5 or even 10 years later whether this reform has been a success or not. While the policymakers are there for perhaps 4 years. Same thing with the large-scale assessments. To run a study, it takes 4 or 5 years from the very beginning to the very end. So even if you go and ask your policymakers, what is it that you're really interested in to learn from our study, then this policymaker might be gone by the time you finish the study. So I think this is something, I really don't have a solution for that. And yesterday evening we were actually discussing heavily, so how can we make sure more that the policymakers are actually using our data. So I'm really glad to hear also from you what could be ideas to help us with that. But I think this is really the fundamental dilemma that we are in. There's also another, perhaps really a disadvantage, and this is related to what you said. So what are we doing? Now we are testing mathematics, science, reading, everything where we think it's easy to compare different countries with each other. We also strive towards testing or looking into the future of education a little bit, but not so much, I would say. So and so I also see like there might be a danger of reproducing what we are right now doing. So the countries want to do well in these assessments. So is it a problem that they actually focus more to the subjects that are actually going to be tested? And I think during the COVID-19 crisis, many of the schools, they could see that were not able to even actually cover in depth all the subjects that are usually there, but they had to concentrate on the major things, and then again it was mathematics and science. So I'll stop here, I guess.
Thank you. Hand over. Thanks, Nina. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here in Rome with colleagues face to face for the first time in a long time. And then I'm going to answer this kind of from 2 different perspectives. And the first is from more of a policy and sort of validity perspective on the studies. And one thing that I would urge in terms of policy usage of these studies is for individual countries and the stakeholders within those countries to take a step back and ask yourself internally, do these studies help us to understand our educational system? And I think this is really relevant to your point, President Ricci, that you say, where do you want the educational system to go? And to have answers to those questions before you even decide to participate. I mean, many of the people that are sitting here today, most of you are from Italy, and so you know you're already participating in these international studies. But I think it's important to think about the aims of your educational system, and not necessarily even about participation or should you participate, but to think what should change about these studies so that they can help us answer the research questions that are most pressing in our society. You know that there's a possibility for national options in educational studies like TIMSS and PISA, and that you can have add-on parts of the study so that you can better answer questions that are relevant to you. But oftentimes, something that's important for Italy might also be important in Belgium, might also be important in the United States. And so, like I said, taking a step back and thinking about what you want to do in your educational system, how the surveys might change to most benefit your policy questions, is a worthwhile endeavor to ask the question about whether the aims of the study, as they're written in the documentation of TIMSS, PISA, PEARLS, do they match the aims of your educational system? And if not, where do they diverge, and how can you better tailor those studies or influence the studies to answer the research questions and the policy questions in your own context? The other part of this is you invited a quantitative methodologist to talk about this, so I'm going to take a methodologist perspective and just ask you to think a little bit about, and I agree with you, the data is very, very high quality on average. The studies are representative, the frameworks are carefully developed, the sampling is very well done. But the quality of the measurement varies greatly across countries, especially the comparability of measures across countries. And I'm not talking necessarily about math or science. Those we know are pretty comparable across cultures. But the other measures, attitudes and perspectives and experiences, there are a lot of differences across cultures in the way that we understand those constructs and the way that we understand the questions that are being asked of us and how we respond to those things. So I think it's very important before you use any of this data to do a rigorous examination within your country, and especially if you're doing cross-cultural comparisons, to make sure that these measures are comparable across countries so that you can feel comfortable to say that the relationship between attitude toward learning and outcomes is the same in Italy, it's the same in the United States, and not until you've done that can you say that that is comparable. So then my last pitch is that in general, there's a shortage of people that are well trained in quantitative methodology, and especially in psychometrics. It's a very small segment of the way that we treat, even in the US and in the Netherlands, where we're sort of the big countries that train psychometricians, we have a shortage. And so to better use this data, I think we need to spend more time and more effort to train people that really understand the models and methods that are used to generate the data. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Could you also put this for hands? This is so smart, it's a very measurement. Thank you. So something has already said now, so I have to focus on a different aspect. And I want to come back to the question. The question was advantages and disadvantages of international and national large-scale assessment reform policy. And I think there are differences when we look at international and national large-scale assessment in terms of their advantages and disadvantages to inform policy. They are somehow complementary in their function, and I want to focus on this. So why, and this has already been said, international large-scale assessment has a high degree of standardization and professionality in the measurements, the psychometry, the way how the sampling is done is absolutely state of the art, and we can get a very good comparison in terms of at least cognitive outcomes. I'm not talking about you mentioned the problems we have in attitudes, but in terms of cognitive outcomes we have a really good comparison, and that is a huge advantage and can help us to develop the national large-scale assessments further. But this step has to be done. So at the moment we see this high level of professional competences in international large-scale assessment, but not in all countries. There's a learning process for national large-scale assessment. This is something in future which needs to be developed more. So, while this is the comparative advantage of the international large-scale assessment, I think the comparative advantage of the national large-scale assessment is in the curriculum alignment. It's very much easier to interpret the results of national large-scale assessment with regard to the curriculum of the countries than the results of international large-scale assessment. And this issue is even of higher importance for those subjects that are not math and science, but when we go to language learning or citizenship education, or let's call it global competences in PISA. So the curriculum alignment is a kind of disadvantage for the international large-scale assessment, and a point where the national large-scale assessment has a merit, while the national large-scale assessment always lacks the comparison, which is the big merit of the international large-scale assessment. So we need them, we need to understand them in a complementary way, and we have to take profit of both of them and to learn from them. And Leslie mentioned already, I think it's very important that international large-scale assessment looks into the national editions of international large-scale assessment, but also into national large-scale assessment. How are certain issues developed there? What new issues are coming up? I'm working in the area of citizenship education, and there I see, for instance, issues of hybrid identities, polarization, multiple citizenship, experience discrimination, transnational issues. And these issues are up to now not taken up as they could be taken up in international civic and citizenship education study or in global competences in PISA. So of course, international studies also can develop based on what is being done on the national level. Do I have 5 or 4 minutes? 4. Then I have to stop.
Thank you very much, Herman. Trying to answer this question in the very short period of time that we have, I came up with some advantages and disadvantages, but trying to think differently from the use of international and national standardized assessments. First, probably you're very young, but several years ago, from 1997, at least in Latin America, having equality in education meant to finish primary school. But then we found out that finishing primary school reported large inequalities in terms of learning. So there's a rich information in terms of understanding inequalities, and I think sometimes we don't use that information very wisely. For example, in Chile, we have measured that by second grade, if you are low performer in second grade, the die is cast. You are condemned to be forever in primary education in the low achieving group. So Bourdieu would dream with this evidence. So there's something of use there. But in that, another advantage besides discovering the size of inequalities is that we can study the factors that affect inequality. And several countries have used national and international large-scale assessments to link information with administrative data. And sometimes we tend to focus very much into achievement. And from the experience of the student, when one thinks on the experience of the student, well, the student is not a learning machine, it's a human being. which is faced with processes in the school, teaching practices, school practices, which is faced, of course, with learning content matter, but developing social-emotional skills, developing civic skills, and other educational outcomes that are several times overshadowed by our focus on achievement only. Achievement doesn't help us if the kid is getting only to second grade. So we need a more balanced perspective. And the problem that we are facing is that the public oversimplifies the outcomes of standardized achievement. I don't know, in Chile, private schools are better. Well, of course, they are far beyond in terms of inequality of socioeconomic status in comparison to other schools. And one challenge, I wouldn't say is a disadvantage, is that evidence-based decision-making is not automatic. It's not that we produce results and the policymaker is going to take it. No, we need to work, and probably this is a challenge for assessment institutions and also the academia to think how to translate in a very simple way the results of our assessments. And that is a challenge because decision makers are not very clever in terms of research or measurement. They have a more political stance, and we need to understand that. Thank you very much.
So, first of all, thank you to our distinguished panel. I believe that this first round of answers already gives a lot of food for thought, and from different perspectives, especially from a comparative one. The next set of questions will be, in fact, questions on communication, effectiveness, contextualization of results, and also an institutional dimension. I'll ask the question, and I ask the panelists to answer to any of them, but I ask anybody to answer to mostly 2 questions just to fit with time. So in terms of communication, my question would be, what could be done to present the results of national and international assessments in a way that reaches several stakeholders, meaning policymakers, educational practitioners, the schools, and avoid the misuse of findings, like avoid the simple use of rankings or similar things. Does anybody want to engage with this question?
I can give it a start. I actually want to, I think Anasta already mentioned this, so I think it's super important to teach actually the researchers to translate their findings into something that can be understood by a broader audience. So I'm reading the DIDATTICA, so it's a journal in German, and they have every week they have a column where they ask professors what they didn't learn at the university, what they need now. And every time, every professor says, I did not learn anything about research communication. So it's almost every week this happens. So the IA takes some approaches, so we actually try to get better with that, certainly, and I think there's a lot of development that has happened within the IA for that. So we have a growing communications team, for example. We provide policy briefs, we provide now teacher snippets, which is a very short communication of some results of our studies, and then we have now a new series even, Research for Educators. So we do some efforts to translate the findings towards other audiences. However, what I think, so I really like the format of this conference here actually. So as I said, the problem is with the policymakers, even if we are managing to translate our results for them, then still they may not be willing to put a lot of money into a reform where they can actually not harvest the results. So perhaps we have to jump over this audience and try to get directly at the educators or teachers, or even the teachers directly. So And why not? So the IA never tells you in the country, okay, so these are the results, and you just have to, I don't know, to give students 2 hours more homework, and then you will, get better results next time. Because we really do not think that makes sense. We do not know your system. But why not coming together in such a way, like this conference here, inviting the teachers, inviting the educators of the teachers, show them the results, and then get into a discussion and into a talk and see what do you think why this is. Yeah, and I think this could really bring us forward into, first of all, understanding, seeing, communicating these results, but also starting this discussion and to make people and teachers think about what am I doing, reflecting what am I doing, so what might be the reasons of doing not so well in terms of specific topics. And here also.
I have one quick comment, just since the microphone's going in this direction, and I'll pass it on. I want to raise one issue that I maybe have an unsatisfactory solution for. A few years ago, I was part of a National Academy of Education workshop, and Judith Singer and Henry Brown led a really nice report about the possibilities of international large-scale assessment. I would recommend that you pick it up. It's free. But one of the things that they raised as a problem is that, at least in the United States, our press has been badly eroded over the last 20 years. There used to be reporters that were specifically dedicated to education, hundreds of them across the country. Now there's a very small handful, and in most newspapers there's no one, or it's the person who writes about sports maybe also writes about education and social and the waves. And so it makes it very difficult to have a conversation with reporters when it's just one of a very small sliver of their work. And so my unsatisfactory solution for that is that I think the international organizations, as well as ideally representatives from each country, would have a press respondent when something that goes out that's incorrect in the popular press, that they could write a letter to the editor and respond about what's correct or incorrect about it.
Yes, I agree to this, that the competence of journalists may be going down, or the number of journalists who are dealing with this may be going down. But on the other hand, the good news is journalists are less important nowadays because social media take over. So from that perspective, it's our responsibility to take the communication in our hands and to look what we can do in order to be better on communicating our studies and to come into contact with teachers. And I think there's a lot to be done and a lot to be learned, both for international large-scale assessment and national large-scale assessment. Sabine mentions the teacher snippets as one new format that the IEA is trying out, but so far there's no evaluation on this, I think, so it will be interesting to see how this will be taken up by teachers within the next years and whether it's a useful format. I think the OECD with PISA did an interesting format where they produced a question-guided booklets on PISA results where the questions were raised from a teacher perspective. So there are some steps in the direction to have more communication for teachers, but I think there's a lot more necessary, and we have to use digital tools to make more use of our large-scale assessment studies. For instance, we could connect the results to formats of teacher professional development. So what we have heard in the lecture before, this teacher professional development could be connected more directly to the large-scale assessment, and large-scale assessment could also be, or parts of large-scale assessment could be used as tools in order to evaluate professional development. So this connection between professional development and large-scale assessment, I think this needs to be strengthened, and this might also lead to improvements within large-scale assessment. Another issue is the test material. You have a lot of released items. And for instance, we used the few released items from the PISA financial literacy test. I think there are only 2 released items so far. And we developed, based on this, we developed our own test. And this test that we developed on the financial literacy, we will turn it into a self-test tool. And the self-test tool will then be, provide information to the students where they can, and teachers where they can be located on the levels, on the proficiency levels within the test. So far, we have no self-test tools developed by the OECD or by the IAEA for their studies that provide this information for students or for school classes where they can locate themselves on proficiency levels. I know this is it's very difficult. It's against the test logic of international large scale assessment because you are doing booklet tests and so on. And I know the arguments against. But nevertheless, I think this is a direction we have to move to when we want to have the acceptance for and when we want to increase the acceptance of international large-scale assessment in the long run within the participating countries. So there are methodological challenges, digital challenges, but we have to work on this. So far for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Herman. So the next question would be concerning the topic of effectiveness. And in a sense, it also connects to the previous lecture. And the question is whether, in your opinion, there are steps that should be taken to be able to use large-scale assessment data available for drawing causal inferences on the effectiveness of educational policies in your country at an international level, and whether you have examples.
Well, this is a matter of a debate. Large-scale assessments can provide you of some approach to causal inference if you are able at least to have a longitudinal data set in which you can kind of control for previous outcomes. And in my point of view, this is the most that you can do with large-scale assessment. There is a debate with experimentalists, I would say, in which this area tries to draw conclusions from randomized control trials, as the previous lecture. And the challenge there is that we have a tension between generalizability in the two, causal inference in the two approaches. Probably you have better causal inferences when you perform randomized control trials, but with limited generalizability. And it seems to me that for understanding specific issues, randomized control trials are better to understand the workings of different mechanisms that could improve achievement. And this has been done several times in Chile. For instance, we work in a program called A Good Start, which teacher development program, randomized control trial, follow kids from kindergarten up to date. And we are able to follow the kids because we were able to link the randomized experimental data with the large-scale assessment, national large-scale assessment. And we can follow through all the educational trajectory, how the participation in this specific program in preschool for disadvantaged kids in poor schools reported benefits or not in the long run. However, this is the implications of this research are limited to a specific set of municipalities where we work. However, for decision makers, they want to look at the system and to try to draw inferences regarding the effectiveness of different policies or change of policies in the long run and in a longitudinal way. And it seems to me, at least in knowing the systems in Latin America, we don't have a lot of information, longitudinal information in the assessment systems. And we don't have a lot of linking between assessment data and administrative data. Chile does it, and it's a very rich source of information to try to understand this balance between achievement, schooling, and other different outcomes. It seems to me that causal inferences can be better reported for policy making with larger scale assessments in terms of effectiveness of a specific. But we need to develop a more rigorous way of connecting with randomized control trials. I think we have a gap there.
Thank you, Ernesto. If there is nobody else interested in this specific question, I would in fact
I think there are some people in the room who would hate me if I would not say something about this, because we had a very, very hard discussion yesterday evening about that. But I'm here and the others are not, so I can go away. So that's my advantage now. I think there is a long lasting debate about making causal inference with large-scale assessment data. And yes, there are some approaches, use longitudinal data, try to enhance the data with information that we have at the country level about the response, and so on and so forth. However, I mean, making a pure, high quality or a causal inference that is really that can actually not be achieved, I would say, in sociology or in education is kind of an area of sociology. We do not have a different earth somewhere where we can say, okay, everything else is being held constant, and here we do a treatment, and on that earth we do not do the treatment. So I also have some friends working in medicine, and even there it's really, really hard to get an absolutely high quality randomized trial. So what we still try to do, so we also figured out during the last years, even though we did never do any causal claims with our data, we also figured out that this is kind of unsatisfying for people who want to use our data. So we said, okay, let's see how can we, and I call it now, approach a bit more causality. So making, or David would say, having data that is less biased. And we actually started within the IEA, my colleague is actually doing that, Rolf Striethold. We have a group now that tries to look into this, tries to adopt methods also from the economists and other methods that approach some causal claims. And I just want to stop here because perhaps that's not so interesting for everyone here in the room. But so we try to get better in approaching causality in education. I still would not believe that you can use this data for a pure and absolutely correct and free of bias causal claim. That's my opinion.
Thank you, Sally. Roberta?
If I may, I would like to add something what you were saying. I fully agree with you, but for me, the most important thing is at least to try to go in this direction. It's extremely important. Otherwise, I don't want to say we are useless, of course, but we should go in this direction. Of course, we have to be careful, but we cannot avoid to take this challenge. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult. Because I think it's related with the first question as well. Sometimes we as a researcher community, we have more or less in front our teachers, and we are afraid not to be so precise because we We like to be in front of our teachers, of our teacher at the university, so we want to be very precise, very strict, but I think, of course, we have to keep in mind the limitations of our approach to causality. I like this expression, but we have to do in this direction. We have to go some in this direction.
I agree with the wish and say we have to do this, but on the other hand, I would like to reduce the pressure a little bit. Because in my countries, half of the educationalists say there is no causality at all. And in this situation, it would be too much pressure to expect from us with this kind of study that we then have to deliver the causality. And therefore, I try to use an additional strategic tool to show the usefulness of these international and national large-scale assessment. That is the tool to call it descriptive knowledge. And we need some descriptive knowledge about the system. And it's useful to see the differences between the north and south of Italy, even if I'm not totally able to explain these differences in the study, because then I know I have to react to these differences, and perhaps I have to invest in the south a little bit more than in the north. And therefore, I would say we can't proceed without providing precise causal claims. But on the other hand, I totally agree with you. We should try to go as far as possible.
Thank you very much. I jump on the last two questions also because time is running short. The first is a bit concerning contextualization. I mean, we have talked about tension or the complementarity between between national and international large-scale assessment. So I ask you, what could be done in order to better contextualize international and large-scale assessment into the national and regional realities of education? Anybody want to take the challenge?
So my thought on this, and something that I've been thinking about for a lot of years in terms of the value of international large-scale assessment and what it can be done. Years ago, I was part of a workshop in a part of the world where education isn't great, and the outcomes for a lot of students aren't great. And I was there, and I don't want to name names because I don't want to shame anyone, but I was there during the release of TIMSS. And in this group of countries, there was a high performer, and they were very happy with their results, a high performer in the region, and the other countries were not so happy. And the first question that came out of their mouths was, how do we become like Singapore? And in this country that's very, very, very different, in this group of countries that are very, very different than Singapore, that's not the question to ask. The question to ask in that region is, well, how can we be like the top performer in our region, where we share a lot of cultural, language, geographic similarities? And so I think what can be taken from international assessments and used in that way is to compare yourself to countries that are like you. In the Scandinavian region, I lived in Norway for a couple of years, and I think there was a lot of fruitful work done to say, hey, how can Norway be a bit more like Finland? I mean, there are a lot of cultural differences there as well, but it's a closer comparison than to say, how can Botswana be like Finland? Or how can Cambodia be like Singapore? Like, those are not sensible to me. So I think the regional comparisons are something that are more valuable.
But sometimes politicians want to travel to those countries where you actually see the best results. I once had a study tour from Yemen, and it was supported by German developmental aid, and these Yemeni educational politicians, they didn't want to go to Jordan, which would have made sense, they wanted to go to Finland. And this is very difficult to bridge, and I would like to learn from your experience how you make countries focus on those neighboring countries they might learn from the most.
I don't think you can make them, but I think it's valuable to encourage it. And I think the IEA did a really nice job with that, where they had regional workshops where groups of countries came together, learned how to do data analysis, and learned how to understand the context of their educational system within the region.
Well, I think that building on what Leslie said, international large-scale assessments serve as a starting point, not as the end point. And the issue here is that several of the international studies focus very much into, well, of course, achievement and some factors that may explain achievement at the school and student level. However, many of the studies didn't do a good job or don't do a good job looking at what were the policies in the long run that have produced that some countries are far, far away in terms of achievement in comparison to others. And that's something in terms of communication, in terms of bridging the evidence-based gap that should be done in international studies. For example, in the study of UNESCO, started in the third study, last study, and continuing now, we are looking at what is the story behind the improvement on achievement within countries. And very basic information, you know, not very descriptive information, and what could be the policies that might have influenced that improvement. Is what improved, for example, in attendance to school that led to improvement in outcomes. Well, there was one policy which put public transportation for kids to get them to school every day. Well, that kind of information is very useful for decision makers. Even more than very sophisticated statistical analysis. So that's the effort of translation that doesn't report academically, I would say. For us, it's not a paper or a book that counts, but it's part of the job. We need to produce sensible information for this specific audience. And also, I think for teachers, it's very important to think in teachers. We have these levels of achievement and whatever in very, very general terms, but there are less sophisticated ways of telling the teachers, for example, well, your kids are very good at reading, but only narrative texts. They are not able to read very well scientific texts. Well, that's very, very important. Not sophisticated, you're not going to get a Nobel Prize for a paper on that, but very useful for decision makers. And that's part of the contextualization that we need to work in order to produce more validity of the international scales.
Thanks, Ernesto. So,
just 1 second. I think in international surveys could help us also, in considering how different situation can produce the same result. For instance, we have very different situation in Korea and in Finland, but very similar results. So it could help us in order to go more in depth, not to rely on platitudes. For instance, we have a big debate at national level about the class size. It's not a kind of everyday solution, every problem solution. To be entirely honest, I don't think we have this kind of problem, but it's quite easy to use it with the public opinion. So, I think it could help us a lot in how can I say, how necessary it is to go in depth to the problem. Thank you.
Mille, thank you very much. So last question I would ask is a question that has to do with the institutional dimension. So as an institution, because you all represent the institution in your countries, what should you prepare for to safeguard the role of international large-scale assessments as evidence providers for policy purposes? And anybody wants to start? Anybody wants to start?
I would start with deconstructing the question. What are you asking us? You are asking the national institutions how they can safeguard the international large-scale assessment, right?
Well, not just that. I mean, there is institutions that provide, large-scale assessment at national and international level. The question is the role of these national and international large-scale assessment as evidence, tools for evidence, and that could be, let's say, challenged. So the issue is, what can you do as an institution?
Okay. Then I would say basically we have to look at the notes from this panel and take all those topics out where we saw these are things that might improve the studies and especially the communication and usage of the studies within the educational field. And I think that's the best remedy against any decreasing acceptance of international large-scale assessment, to work on the usage of the studies, because when we go back to sociology studies on research usage, they say users have two tests with regard to research. They have the usability test and the trustworthy test. And at the moment, I think the trustworthiness is not so much in question as the usability. Therefore, I think we have to focus our energy on the usage and on side products we develop out of these studies that make use of them.
Thank you very much. Ernesto and Roberto.
Well, I think embedded in the question is how we position in front of some ideas that we are the bad guys. You know, we standardize kids, and standardized assessment is kind of a challenge or for teachers, for schools, especially in the context of high stakes assessments. And we need to think very much on the usage, and policymakers tend to not be very wise in using these elements, because they tend to think that this is like a machine in which you are producing products and then you measure. And if it doesn't work, you put pressure on whoever is behind the failure. Sometimes regardless considerations of inequality, of inclusion. Therefore, in my point of view, especially to gain track among teachers, among schools, it is very important to focus on educational justice, and not only on averages, but how kids are distributed. What are the main patterns of inequalities? What are the main patterns of teaching gaps that we could improve? Well, those are very key questions that we need to ask ourselves from the larger scale assessments.
Thank you very much, Roberto.
I would agree we should capitalize more on the usage of the data at very high level, and for me, very high level means at school level. It's the highest level, it's our highest duty. And I think we have a lot of things that we could share with schools. And I'm thinking on the items, materials, tasks that we could try to give to schools, not in the perspective that we have to use for a national or international measurement, but to make it, how can I say, useful for schools. Just to give an example, we have very sophisticated items. It's very important to have it, because otherwise it's impossible to provide good measure. It's extremely important. But at the same time, we can translate it, the idea, what we intend to measure, and what is the message that we can use with the school system in order to work on this kind of items, or task or whatever. I think this is very, very important. For me, it's the highest level of usage that we have in front. And I think this is our, at least for our institution, is use our material for schools. It means to translate, adapt it for schools, not only in the measurement perspective. Without it, it's impossible to have this kind of material. Just to be clear, I think the high quality of our data is the main aspect of our job, but at the same time, I think the highest level is not the policy makers, but our schools.
Thank you to our panelists, because I believe that we have had a very interesting discussion. I'm conscious of the fact that we're already eating into lunchtime, but if there is a question from the audience, I guess that this is an opportunity to have our international panelists answering. Any question anywhere? No, it's too close to lunch. Okay, we talk at lunch. Thank you very much for your